welcome. I'm Tomas Eridani and this is Story Scanner, a podcast based on the stories headlining Via Sarfatti 25, the magazine from Bocconi University, with analysis and insights from Bocconi professors and researchers on the big topics in business, management, data science and politics. In this episode, we take a look at the world of crowdfunding. Used for multiple purposes, from charitable projects through to music bands to fund a new album, crowdfunding has really taken off in recent years by startup companies or growing businesses as a way of accessing alternative funds. It is an innovative way of sourcing funding for new projects, businesses, or ideas. And some studies show that crowdfunding is becoming a substitute for venture capital investments at the seed stage. Other studies estimate the global crowdfunding market reached a value of $13.3 billion in 2021, and that the global market will continue to grow 15% annually in the upcoming years. This has also been helped by regulatory changes. When the SEC changed its crowdfunding regulations in 2020 to allow companies to raise up to $5 million, a big bump from the previous $1 million cap, more startups embraced the method to raise early-stage capital. And in November last year, the new European crowdfunding regulation came into force, harmonizing how retail investors invest in startups and enabling crowdfunding platforms to provide services across the EU market. Investing in ventures and projects through crowdfunding today passes mainly through equity crowdfunding, in which funders receive a small amount of ownership in the business, and rewards-based funding, where funders pledge a contribution to a project in exchange for access to the product or an enhanced set of rewards. But crowdfunding is transforming entrepreneurship in more ways than just finance. Early-stage entrepreneurs are in fact widely turning to crowdfunding to also test ideas, build a community around a potential product, and to market a new product. The need for funds is in fact not always at the top of their motivations. Charles Williams, Professor of Business Strategy at Bocconi, is going to tell us more about the rise of crowdfunding in recent years, the crowdfunding forms that entrepreneurs are turning to, and their motivations for engaging with crowdfunding.
So yes, crowdfunding really has been growing markedly in the last 10 years. In fact, in Italy, it's really exploded just in the last few years. As of 2018, this whole space, it's sometimes called alternative finance, was about 500 million in funding in 2018. And by 2020, the last year we have full data for, it was nearly 2 billion. So it's been growing very quickly. Now, this whole space of crowdfunding includes a number of different types of things. There's lending, actually, which really rose as something called peer-to-peer lending, where you might actually contribute to a loan for someone who's trying to get their way out of debt, consolidate all their debts and get out of it. Though it is growing rapidly in this space for companies. There is donation-based crowdfunding, where you contribute to help someone. It's really humanitarian. You might contribute these days to refugees from Ukraine or from Syria, or for friends or distant people who have crises around health. There's a rising category that's very important for entrepreneurship. When we started this research, honestly, which was a couple of years ago, it wasn't that important. It was quite small still. It's called equity crowdfunding. And this is much closer to what we think of as traditional investment. You make a small funding offer and you actually receive a small amount of equity. So if this company grows, is quite profitable, you'll benefit from that. Early days, this was quite restricted by government regulation, but actually Italy's been among the first countries to really open this and liberalize it. And the US government, the SEC, has finally, as you mentioned in your opening, has made this much more possible for non-expert investors. But the last kind of crowdfunding, which has been very important in recent years for entrepreneurship, is reward-based. And that means you make a contribution. You're not going to get any ownership, but you may get early access to the product, or some sort of benefit related to the product. So it really appeals to people who are passionate in this space. And that's just opened up a whole new range of options for early stage entrepreneurship of how you can go both to how you can go to get resources, but also how you can connect with your most passionate future consumers. Now, for researchers, the rise of crowdfunding has been an incredible, exciting event because it takes some parts of entrepreneurship that have been very invisible, these early stages of how you assemble funding and other resources, and brings them into a digital space where we can observe them. And so early studies in this area have basically looked at signals of quality. What are some things that the crowd audience might react to and reward in the way you're pitching your project? And they've found a number of things that really overlap with what we found in more traditional entrepreneurship, which is that signals of quality, who you are, what your background is, where you've worked before, but especially evidence of your past successes in this space, how extensively you've prepared this project or product. Do you have prototypes that you've developed? And finally, how broad is your social network? People who have larger Facebook communities, larger connections to others, they've been more successful in raising funds. But that's then led to another area of research around narratives and storytelling, a whole nother side of communication that entrepreneurs need to master.
As early-stage entrepreneurs increasingly turn to crowdfunding, it is in fact important how they tell their story to potential funders. In these early stages, to attract resources from funders, entrepreneurs develop narratives that address who they are, why they are qualified, and what they want to do, to compensate for the lack of a performance history. And such narratives affect success in mobilizing resources. Professor Williams has recently published a working paper looking at how crowdfunding audiences react to entrepreneurial narratives, with a particular focus also on the role of the how aspect of ventures in narratives. That is, including in the story the experimentation and planning aspects and the description of the strategy to develop a project. He tells us more about the findings of his study, what emerges regarding the impact of different types of narratives on crowdfunding projects, and some best practices for entrepreneurs to gain access to resources.
This project has been a lot of fun and really exciting for me. It is joint with Chiara Spina, who is a Bocconi graduate, but who is now an entrepreneurship professor at INSEAD in Singapore. And she came to me early in the PhD. She was very interested in crowdfunding and had begun tracking and downloading lots and lots of projects, basically all the ones that were up and tracking all the discussion around them. So in the end, we've ended up with over 50,000 projects on Kickstarter, one of the most popular crowdfunding platforms. And we have hopped into this discussion about storytelling or narratives by entrepreneurs. Now, we all believe, and there's some evidence this is true, that effective storytelling is a very important part of how you engage audiences, how you make it compelling, really make people identify with what you're doing. But there's a particular challenge for entrepreneurs, which is, of course, their story is not over. A typical story arc has, a beginning, a middle, and an end, maybe a hero, a woman or man who faces some challenge. They've overcome this, and we have this sort of dramatic resolution when they've solved the problem. But in early stages of entrepreneurship, you're really right in the middle of engaging that problem, trying to solve it. So how do you tell a story in that case? It's generally accepted that what you do in this case, and also in the case of innovation, where you haven't developed the innovation yet, that entrepreneurs use fragments of stories, in a sense, these pieces that are building blocks of stories that maybe their audience may put together in different manners that make sense really to them. And we've pulled out these two building blocks that we think are especially important, that are, as you said, Tommaso, that are around how the entrepreneur is developing the project or the venture. And back, for a long time in entrepreneurship, there's really been this idea of two fundamental approaches to new projects. And those are planning, just classic business planning. You have sort of sub-steps you're going to take, kind of steps you're going to go through to finish this project, and then a timetable. When will you do them by? So classic what by when. And then there's another approach, and Chiara has done lots of research in other areas on this as well, which we generally refer to as experimentation. So you go in, you actually don't know how you're going to solve the problem that's in front of you, and you will try different things. You'll experiment with different approaches. I know we've talked about this in other work at Bocconi on this in other podcasts here. Now, so what we did is we wondered, so if an entrepreneur shares with the audience the things they've been doing that either fit with this planning story or an experimentation narrative, will that really resonate with audiences? And in particular, in what cases? It's never just yes or no in the real world. There's always in some cases that's valuable, in some cases it's not. And here's what we found, basically, looking at when people on Kickstarter with projects talked about planning or experimentation. We found in general, yes, this helps. The projects are more successful when you do this. But the relative success really depends on who you are. And in particular, it depends on your past experience. So if you're new to the platform, if you're a sort of a newcomer, a complete newbie, then talking about experimentation really helps your level of success. So the audience knows you're new. They may see you as not really expert in this area, but if you tell them how you're learning by doing, the steps and the experiments and the trials you're doing, it really convinces them that you're on the path to figuring this out and doing something of value. So actually, that was the highest level of success we saw, these newcomers who talked about experimentation. On the other hand, as you come back to the platform, some people will come back, 2, 5, 6. There's one case of someone who's over 100 times they've been back with different projects. Those people don't see much benefit from talking about experimentation. We think and we have some evidence of this, that is because at that point you're supposed to be an expert in this area. But if you talk about learning by doing and experimentation, it tends to undermine that assessment of you as expert. What you're doing is acknowledging what you don't know yet. And for entrepreneurship, that may be honest and true, even if you're an expert. But for pitching projects, it turns out to the crowd, this is not such a good move. In those cases, when you're more experienced, we see still a substantial benefit to talking about talking about planning. And this, in fact, is even more credible if you're more experienced. You can imagine why. If you see someone coming back time and time again, and they tell you, this is what's going to be necessary to do this project, here's when I expect to have it done by. Well, they have repeated experience here. We can believe more in what they're doing. So anyway, I would say there's two interesting elements of this research in the end, the things that we found interesting from it. And that is, one, that talking about your process of how you're doing this is one way to help win over the audience in this very uncertain situation of early stage entrepreneurship. And the other is that the story you tell really needs to be consistent with who you are, your identity, your observable sides of your identity. If you try to tell a story about learning by doing, but you're seen as an expert, those two things are going to clash with each other. But if you're an expert and you use this planning approach, this planning narrative, the audience will really accept that and in fact reward it. So, we've found this an interesting area to do research, and we're going forward and looking at other projects we can do in this space as well.
We are now joined by Benedetto Pirro, Bocconi alumnus and co-founder of Crowdfundme, a crowd investing platform listed on the stock exchange that since it started operations in 2016 has raised nearly 71 million euros to fund 144 successful projects. He shares with us his perspective and advice on how entrepreneurs should best prepare for a crowdfunding project.
Crowdfundme is particularly focused on early stage and scale-up companies. Therefore, it's not seed and pre-seed. That means that to be prepared for a crowdfunding campaign and to raise the right amount of capital expected in a crowdfunding campaign, the company has to have some traction. It has to have a story to tell. It can't be too early stage. It can't be a business plan or something more. You have to have numbers. You have to have customers. You have to have everything that makes storytelling easier, because that's the main point of a crowdfunding campaign. It's storytelling. It's convincing investors who invest in 3 minutes, 4 minutes maximum that your project is credible, your project will grow, but today it already has a story to tell. Therefore, when we select our campaigns, we look at two main, let's say, macro sectors. The first, if it's technological and radical innovation, we will look if there are any patents, if there have been partnerships with universities and other science atheneums. Instead, if it's incremental and innovation therefore on the service side, we'll be looking at mainly numbers of customers, possible revenues, and other financial data. So those are the main two aspects you have to have when you come and apply for a crowdfunding campaign on Crowdfundme.
More in general, from his vantage point, he tells us what he is seeing in terms of trends and projections in the world of crowdfunding.
In terms of trends and projections, 2022 will be a very important year for equity crowdfunding in Italy and in Europe. By the end of the year, all European countries will have to apply to the pan-European harmonized European regulation regarding equity crowdfunding. This will bring big changes to all European platforms due to the fact that borders will be broadened. There won't only be a regulation for Italy, France, and Germany, but there will be one regulation for all countries, giving the chance for European investors to invest in European crowdfunding platforms. In Italy, we are very lucky because since 2016, our regulation is state of the art. But on the other hand, Italian projects are only offered towards Italian investors. By the end of the year, Italian projects will be offered at 360 degrees. Another important change that potentially will occur during this year or in the following years is driven by the fact that the European regulation also gives the chance for crowdfunding platforms not only to offer equity projects, but also lending. This gives the chance of broadening alternative investors for retail, and at that stage, potentially also attracting different types of retail investors. Given the trend of the market we see today in Crowdfundme, we've been seeing focus from the investors on scale-up projects. This means that they're projects that have 2-3 years of traction, and therefore we've started to forget early stage and potentially projects with the highest revenue potential, maybe because they have at that moment lower pre-money valuations. Certainly investing in scale-up reduces the risk, or at least the sense of risk the investors have. But at the end of the day, multipliers, once exits start to come, won't be as high as if you invest in early stage. I strongly think that in this year, we'll move back to early stage investments, or not maybe call them early stage, but a bit earlier than scale up, because at that stage, there's the highest potential of multipliers once the exits are made, even though the risk is potentially higher.
I hope you enjoyed hearing about what is happening in the world of crowdfunding. You can read more about this topic and many others in the new issue of Via Sarfatti 25 magazine, with opinion, research and insights from Bocconi professors and researchers. I'm Tommaso Eridani, and I hope you'll join me again for the next episode of Story Scanner.